Blog Talk Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to episode 23 of the show about the show. I am the host and creator of this podcast. My name is Devlin Clark. You can find me on Twitter at Devlin_Clark _ Clark84. That's DEVLIN_Clark84. Also, please listen to my podcast and give us a 5-star review if you like it. That helps us to get more recognition on iTunes, and the more people who like it on iTunes, the more this podcast can become successful. I am so excited about today's episode. So, the episode that I have today, I have a New York Times best-selling author on the show today. I have a gentleman who has written over 20 books in his long life. His last 4 books are related to the New York Yankees. He also had a pretty cool job in the summer of 1968. He's worked as an executive producer on television. He is a former director of public relations for the New York Yankees. His name is Marty Appel, and he will be joining us here shortly. Marty is going to join me, and we will take a trip back throughout his illustrious career and listen as this wonderful, wonderful storyteller and man and author talks all about writing and how he comes up with the book ideas and just kind of working for the Yankees and having a perspective on baseball that not a lot of people have. So that is what today's episode is going to be. It is going to be the next 60 minutes of your day. So it will be fun. Marty is an outstanding guy. He is a great author. Like I said, he's written over 20 books. I want to say he told me 24 is the number, and he's got a new book coming out next week that we are going to talk about. So that will be fun to do. And we will also, like I said, talk about his job in the summer of 1968. So you do not want to miss that. He had one of, probably the coolest jobs of all time. I'm not going to spoil what it is because I want to let Marty tell the story, but it is an incredibly, incredibly, incredibly amazing story. It relates to probably the biggest legend and one of the biggest legends in baseball history. So it's no big deal, but at the same time it's also a very, very big deal. So it's one of those things that I'm looking forward to. I'm gonna have Marty talk about, and it's just gonna be a lot of fun. Marty is a New York Times bestselling author. One other thing that you guys might not know about Marty, he also has won an Emmy Award. So he is not only a New York Times bestseller, he's also an Emmy Award winner, and we will get into that as well. While we're waiting for Marty to get here or to call in, I'm going to go over a couple of podcast episodes that I have coming up. So I have 2 more podcasts coming up this evening. I have another podcast here in about 3 hours or so with Drew from Let Me Get That Potograph. That is going to be episode 2 in the Collector's Corner series. Episode 1 was with the lady Susan LaJudy, from Topps, and we talked all about the hobby and Topps and the images and autographs and everything like that. So that was a lot of fun. We are going to talk with Drew. He has, like I said, he has a podcast as well called Let Me Get That Potographed. And he he is going to come on, and we are going to talk about that. And yes, so he's going to be on, and we are going to talk about everything going on from everything else going on. So, without any further ado, I have Marty here. So I'm going to bring Marty on. Again, he is Marty Appel. He has written over 20 different books, including several Yankees books, what a lot of people consider to be the definitive book about the New York Yankees history and the team. And he's gonna share some of his stories. Marty, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you very, very much for coming on and having me, allowing me to share some of your time with you today.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So let's talk a little bit about early on. You were born in Brooklyn, New York, and you graduated from State University with a degree in political science and journalism. Can you talk about kind of the road that led you to State and what made you decide to do political science and journalism?
Well, at Oneonta, where I went to school, they didn't have a journalism major per se, but I was sports editor and then editor-in-chief of my campus weekly newspaper. And I majored in political science because I've always had an interest in that. After my freshman year, I just got a flash in my brain to write a letter to the Yankees PR director, Bob Fischel, and inquire as to whether there might be a summer job available. I didn't even define what it would be, just a summer job. I thought there'd be hundreds of such requests, and I kind of thought I wouldn't even hear back. But in the late 60s, which is the period we're talking about, there weren't a lot of college students who were interested in baseball. Baseball was going through a really down period. And the idea that a college student would want to work in that field turned out to be kind of remote. So actually, mine was the only such letter that he got. And he did have a little PR crisis at the time, in that Mickey Mantle, at the height of his popularity, was receiving so much fan mail that Mickey wasn't going to answer it. He wasn't going to keep up. So they needed somebody to answer the mail, and here was my letter, and there were all those unanswered letters, and I got hired. So it was really a quirk of good fortune, good fate, good timing. It wouldn't happen again today, I don't think. But in 1967, it was a heck of a good opportunity for me.
For sure. Talk about what that whole experience was kind of like. I mean, imagine just being an 18-year-old kid and working for probably the most famous baseball team in America and handling mail for arguably the biggest baseball player in America. What was that whole experience like? That must have had to have been pretty surreal.
Well, it was totally wonderful because I really was a Mickey Mantle fan and a New York Yankees fan since I was a little boy. So this was, stepping into paradise for me. The letters themselves to Mick were not very interesting. Dear Mickey, you're my favorite player. Please send me an autographed baseball. Nevertheless, I did manage to always pull out 2 or 3 letters that I thought I needed to go over with him in person. So it would give me FaceTime with him. And we actually hit it off very nicely. He was really nice to me. He was a terrific guy to be around. And it gave me time to go pull up a stool next to his in the Yankee clubhouse. And we would talk about, the letters, which would take 20 seconds. But then we talked about other stuff, too, and we formed a genuine friendship out of it.
What were some of the other things? Obviously share as much as you want, but what are some of those other things that you and Mickey Mantle talked about besides the letters?
It might be hard for me to remember right now. Not that I wouldn't talk about it, but I'll tell you one little anecdote, which was kind of special. In spring training one year, he and I and 2 or 3 other guys walked from our hotel to the nearby movie theater, and we saw The Last Picture Show, which is an old film now with Sybil Shepherd was in it. And it took place in this Dust Bowl forlorn town in Oklahoma, Texas area. And it really hit home with Mickey because that's where he was from. And as we were walking out, I saw he had a tear, on his cheek. And I was like, "Are you crying?" And he said, "I was just like my hometown." No kidding. And he said, "We even had a village idiot just like the one in the movie." So that was a pretty special memory to share that with him.
Absolutely. Did you... What other people in the clubhouse? I mean, obviously, handling fan mail, you get up close access that a lot of people don't. Well, who are some other players that you remember kind of being around and being very fond of for the Yankees in that time period?
Well, it's interesting you ask because I was most fond of the guys who knew me by name. That's meant so much that a Yankee player knew my name. One of the first you don't think of as a Yankee, but we got Rocky Colavito the summer of '68. And since he was new, he felt like he had to learn everybody's names. So I was one of them, and Rocky Colavito knew my name, and Ruben Amaro knew my name, and Steve Whitaker, an outfielder, knew my name, and we used to play fungo out on the field before batting practice. So Tommy Tresh knew my name. Hard to remember back to the team from 1968. But there were a bunch of guys who did, and that meant a lot to me.
Absolutely. So you were handling Mickey's mail for a couple of years, and then in 1970 you were 21 years old and you got a promotion. Talk about what position you got and what promotion you got.
Well, Bill Guilfoyle was Bob's assistant, the assistant PR director. He got an opportunity to go to the Pittsburgh Pirates as their top guy and did. That left the position of Bob's assistant open, and Bob called me. I was still in college, remember. I had only been working during college breaks in the summer. And he called me up in college, and he said, "This position is open. We need to fill it now. Would you be interested?" And boy, I couldn't let that go. So I arranged with some teachers to finish up by independent study. I had 1 semester left. And bang, one Friday I was in Oneonta studying political science. And 10 days later, I was in Fort Lauderdale for my first spring training.
Wow. That's a really, really neat story. So then you hold the role of Assistant Public Relations Director for 2 years until 1973, and then you get promoted to Public Relations Director. You take over Bob's job by George Steinbrenner. What was that conversation like?
Well, Bob Fischel was moving on to the American League office to be their PR director. And so that left that vacancy, and the culture of baseball was generally that the PR positions kind of went to newspaper guys who had been around the team for years. So they tended to be older guys. Hiring somebody my age, 24, was really a leap. It just really wasn't done. But George Steinbrenner was a new owner. He was only 42 himself. He didn't really know the culture of the game. And he called me in and he asked me if I felt I was capable of doing Bob Fischel's job. And actually I was. I felt very confident in that because I'd learned from Bob Fischel for like 4 years doing the fan mail and being his assistant. So I said, yes, I've learned from the best. So he said, okay, you're my new PR director. And I think I remain the youngest ever in Major League Baseball. And, of all teams, the New York Yankees, the most high-profile team of all, it was really quite an honor.
Absolutely. And you did, and that is correct. You were and still are the youngest PR director in Major League Baseball history at the age of 23. So you're there for most of the mid-'70s, and then early 1977 something changes. What happens in early 1977?
Well, agents were becoming prominent and making a lot of money on players' contracts. They'd been scorned until mid-'70s, and that all changed with the Catfish Hunter signing with the Yankees. So Joe Garagiola Jr. and I both were working for the Yankees, and we were working hard on these contracts and on the PR that went with it, and we kind of looked at each other and we said, everybody's getting rich off these contracts except us. Why don't we become them? And we decided we were going to form an agency and represent the ball players. And so with mixed emotions, I didn't really want to leave the Yankees, but economically it made sense. Joe is still a vice president with Major League Baseball. He became general manager of the Diamondbacks when they were in the World Series, and we remained very close friends. And off we went. That was when I left the Yankees formally. Although, as I'm sure you'll get to in the progression of my career, the connections and the ties to the Yankees stayed close to this day.
Absolutely. You mentioned 1977. You started a sports management company. You handled public relations for the New York Apples of the World Team Tennis. And normally I don't get into tennis, but the one that team had a very interesting member on it, and that was Billie Jean King. Can you talk about what the mid-'70s was like in terms of tennis and for Billie Jean King?
Yeah, I don't want to get too far off baseball, but I would say that working with Billie Jean King was as much a thrill for me as Mickey Mantle. Now, I knew I'd get a kick out of Mickey Mantle because I'd been a fan since I was a kid. I didn't know that about Billie Jean King, but getting to work with her, I mean, let's face it, she's Jackie Robinson. She's of that importance culturally, and it was a tremendous honor and thrill to work and travel with Billie Jean as we went from tennis match to tennis match around the country.
So when that league folded, you decided to follow in the footsteps of Bob, and you joined the staff of Major League Baseball and the commissioner, at the time, Bowie Kuhn. Talk about that decision.
Yeah, I was happy to get back into baseball, especially being unemployed since the tennis league had folded. So I went back in as a spokesman for Commissioner Kuhn, and ultimately, even after I wrapped up there, I collaborated with him on his memoir, which was called Hardball, and it was a terrific opportunity to just work with him and recap. I think it was 17 years he was commissioner. My job was to sort of keep him on schedule, come in prepared with all the events of each year and have him give his opinions and everything on that. Ultimately, history hasn't been that kind to him since he lost so many battles to Marvin Miller, but just the history he was involved with and the way he took baseball into its modern era in terms of marketing and television and, the advances that were made, taking it from a small mom-and-pop business into, you could really say, during that time, into the huge structure that it is today.
You mentioned Marvin Miller and his battles with Bowie Kuhn. Did you witness any of those firsthand? No,
not any of their in-person phone calls or personal meetings.
Okay.
But I was an admirer of Miller. Didn't have, like a rooting interest in him losing because I felt like he was on the right side of justice there. And I think Kuhn kind of knew it was happening too, and there was little he could do about it. But Miller had tremendous success in all he advocated, and to see the game the way it is today. I mean, so many owners back then were fearful that free agency was going to kill baseball, that the teams couldn't hold on to their stars was going to be the ruination of baseball. And it turned out to be quite the opposite. The players got very rich, and the fans loved the off season for the free agent signings and, how interest stayed high 12 months a year. And then you get these new stars on different teams every spring. And Giancarlo Stanton wasn't a free agent. That was a trade. But that's sort of the feeling, like now Yankee fans can't wait for the start of the 2018 season because of a player of that magnitude suddenly having arrived.
Absolutely. So after you get done working for Commissioner Kuhn, you served as the VP for Public Relations for a TV station, WPIX, in New York, where you won an Emmy Award as the executive producer of Yankee Telecasts, a position you held until 1992. Talk about not only that whole experience in terms of being the executive producer for the Yankee Telecast, but also winning the Emmy Award, because that had to be a pretty cool moment.
That was pretty cool. The Emmy's still on display. I didn't tuck it away anywhere. I'll tell you the truth. Of all my stops in my career, WPIX might have been my happiest, and I say that even with having worked for the Yankees. I totally loved the television industry. It was fascinating to me. Such a bigger industry than baseball was. So much more to know and learn. I was also the PR director for the station, so I had to understand the news operation, public affairs, commercials, how they got placed,
Sure.
the technology. The satellites were coming in then. WPIX became a superstation. It was a fascinating time, and I loved every minute of it. And then I became the executive producer of the Yankee Telecast, so I was back in that universe again.
Now, you've also done, in addition to that, you've also done some work for the Olympics and also for the Topps Company. What did you do for Topps?
I was Topps' first public relations director. The industry had grown so big. You'll remember the early 80s or the early 90s when everybody was getting rich on baseball cards.
Yep.
So the industry was big enough that the little card companies now needed more executive power. They brought me in to handle PR, and that was great. That was fun because I was a collector of Topps cards as a kid, and I enjoyed that a lot. Then the baseball strike came in 1994, and that kind of killed off the industry. It still exists today, but it really never recovered from that strike. So I ultimately got laid off along with 65 other people when the size of the business just shrunk. But I started my own company, Marty Appel Public Relations, and Topps came aboard as my first client. So the association continued. The connection to the Yankees continued because the Yankees were a licensee. And it was just, there's a lot of different stops we're talking about here, but somehow they're all kind of under the same umbrella, and the Yankee connection still held.
Absolutely. So one other really cool thing that you've gotten to do before we kind of delve into your writing career, one other kind of non-writing thing that you got to do that was pretty cool was you assisted in the PR for the Israeli national baseball team at the 2013 WBC. Can you talk about how that came along? And
well, they were one of my PR clients.
Okay.
I always had 10 or 12 clients at a time. They were one of them. There's a fascination among Jewish people for all things baseball, whether it's the literature or the culture of the game or the rules of the game. Jewish people tend to be great baseball fans. And around that time, a fellow up in Boston, Martin Abramowitz, published a set of all Jewish baseball players in history, a set of cards. So he brought me in to do PR for that, and kind of spurred by that, I think, Israel decided to enter a team in the World Baseball Classic. And I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the World Baseball Classic came an attempt to develop a professional league in Israel. The league only lasted one summer, wasn't financially successful, but they brought me in for PR, and I wound up going to Israel to help make this a bona fide league. Because if you think about it, I was like the American baseball executive involved with it. Dan Duquette was obtaining the players, now the general manager of the Orioles. But I was the one who had to make sure there was an official scorer at every game, that the stats were compiled accurately, that they were submitted when they were supposed to be submitted. You know, we needed to make it professional in every sense. So it was a good feeling to know that we got that done, and I wish the league had continued on. But we really didn't attract many fans from the population of Israel, more so just American tourists, and that wasn't going to be enough to sustain the league. But it was a great summer. It gave me a chance to go to Israel. Never thought I would do that.
Did you? You must have had a great sense of pride, obviously, being Jewish and being able to kind of represent your religion in that kind of manner in the sport that you love and you've grown up around. Talk about how that felt, being Jewish, to be able to kind of represent the Israeli national baseball team.
Yeah, well, it was a fun assignment for me, and it felt good to be able to visit Israel. I mean, by no means am I like a prophet coming out of the book of Deuteronomy to talk to Jewish people, but I knew my baseball, and I learned the media, and working with them, visited all the press, all the newspapers and TV stations in Israel. So I was applying what I could to the situation, and it went well. It was a good feeling.
Well, let's dive right into to some of your writing. So, when we were preparing for this interview, I was contacting you, and I was telling you one of the things I really wanted to talk about was King Kelly, because he's such a great figure in baseball history. Talk to me about King Kelly, and also how you got the idea to and the process of writing that book.
Well, the first book I wrote was when I was still with the Yankees. It was a book called Baseball's Best, the Hall of Fame Gallery. And they were 1,500-word essays on every member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. So that was hard work, but for a first book, you kind of put out extra effort to make sure you've got pride in it when it's over. And when I finished writing all those biographies, Mike Kelly, King Kelly as he was nicknamed, kind of stood out to me as a guy I didn't really fully appreciate, didn't know enough about. And his biography, he only lived 36 years, but his biography was fascinating. And he was in many ways the game's first superstar. In fact, this is a little bit of American cultural history that I learned, but the act of autographing kind of began with King Kelly. He was a huge star by the time he went to Boston, being Irish and everything like that.
Sure.
So prior to Kelly, people knew that having a signature of George Washington or General Custer or Abraham Lincoln was a nice thing to have, but nobody pursued celebrities in the streets and said, hey, can I have your autograph? Until Kelly. People knew what time he had to be at the ballpark, and kids would sort of line the streets waiting for his arrival. They'd stick little pieces of paper and a pencil in his hands, and that's where it all began. Mike King Kelly signing his autograph, very few of which survived to this day because they were in pencil. But Kelly became a culturally significant guy, not only through the autographing, but he would appear in the off-season on the vaudeville stage, doing a little song and dance act. Painting of him hung in pretty much every saloon in Boston. Of him, the poem "Slide Kelly Slide," which was actually the first pop hit record when Edison invented the phonograph and people started buying records. So "Slide Kelly Slide" was the first pop hit record. Everybody till then was buying church music or opera or patriotic music, but "Slide Kelly Slide" was the first pop hit. So anyway, I wanted to do a standalone biography of Kelly, and I did. It was published in 1996, and it won the Casey Award as the best baseball book of the year. So that was pretty cool for a kind of small publisher, small, little-known biography. And I'm very happy to have been honored with that, and that book got terrific reaction.
What was that book called for people in case they want to go buy it?
Just what you would expect. It was called "Slide Kelly Slide."
Excellent. You know, one of my favorite anecdotes about King Kelly comes from the baseball series that Ken Burns did, which is just a marvelous series that I recommend for any baseball fan. And they talk about how back then the game had different rules than it did now, and back then all you had to do was announce your presence and you were in the game. And there was a game going on, and the batter hit a foul ball, and he hit a foul pop fly, and Kelly jumped up off the bench and said, Kelly now playing third base for Boston, caught the ball, and it was recorded as an out. So
good for you. That's exactly what happened. And Kelly would also take advantage of the days when there was only one umpire on the field. So he would be known to cut from second to home and miss third base by a lot and get away with it because the umpire was out in the outfield checking on fair or foul out there.
Sure, absolutely. Now, you also wrote a couple of children's biographies about Yogi Berra and Joe DiMaggio. Tell us about those.
It was a series of books, probably about 25 in all, on baseball heroes. So I was asked to do Yogi and DiMaggio, and a lot of things Yankee-oriented have come my way over the years as I've aged and kind of been seen more and more as a guy who knows his Yankee history. So those were two biographies I was happy to do. And Yogi himself became a client when I had my PR company, the Yogi Berra Museum. I was a member of the board of directors there, and I also did PR for the museum, and I got much closer to Yogi than I'd ever been when he was a coach with the Yankees. So that was a really warm friendship because he was just when he'd walk into the room, you just feel better about life. He was such a wonderful guy.
What's your favorite Yogiism?
Well, it's interesting you ask that because I think I may have been present for his last Yogiism. Everybody knows the famous ones, Fork in the Road and things like that. But I went to visit him at his assisted living place when he was in the final stages of his life. I had resisted going, actually, because I just felt it was sort of invading his privacy. But then one day I just said to myself, Marty, what are you talking about? Invading his privacy. He's probably bored to death every day. It's not like you're a fan coming to shake his hand. You're friends. Go see the guy. So I went, and we talked baseball. He was still sharp of mind. I remember talking about how the Yankees had more speed in his day than is generally known. He was telling me how fast Hank Bauer was as a runner. But anyway, when it was time to leave, a nurse had come into the room, and Yogi turned to the nurse and said, what time is 3 o'clock Mass? I think I just saw the last Yogiism. And sure enough, he passed away like 2 weeks later, and it may well have been the last Yogiism. I was present for it.
You've also written books about umpire Eric Gregg, Larry King, Bowie Kuhn, Lee McPhail. But one of the most important players that you've written a book about was Thurman Munson, the Yankee captain. It was called Thurman Munson, an autobiography. And you were quoted as saying it was Thurman's book. He was free to leave out whatever he wanted. What was the process like to go through that? Obviously, you might not. I don't know if you met Thurman or not, and you just had a lot of research working with the Yankees. But what was that process like? Did you work with the family and anything like that?
Well, we knew each other well because I was the Yankee PR guy throughout his career. So he had won the MVP in '76. And I called him and asked him if he was interested in doing a book. And he said no. He thought he was too young. And I said, well, Thurm, somebody's going to do a book about you. You're not going to make any money off it, and you're probably not going to like what it says. Why don't you do your own? Look at it as an insurance policy against that. So that made sense to him, and so we did the book together. And he didn't tell very much about his childhood, which turned out to be quite a difficult childhood in a kind of a loveless home. But the book did okay. Wasn't very controversial, so it didn't get a lot of headlines when it came out. But then when he died 2 years later, the publisher reissued it with a new afterword chapter by me. And as you would expect, that sold a lot. 30 years later, on the 30th anniversary of his terrible plane crash approaching, my publisher at Doubleday called and said, how about a full-blown biography of Thurman, including, his death and the aftermath, which wasn't really part of the first book. So for that, I did a lot of research with the family and other people and high school classmates, things like that. So there came a full-blown biography, which touched on the difficulties of his childhood and all he had to overcome. And that book became my first New York Times bestseller. So that was very well received, and that one is simply called Munson, The Life and Death of a Yankee Captain.
You also wrote a book about Tom Seaver. Why Tom Seaver?
I was a big Tom Seaver fan, even though he was a Met. We actually did 2 books together. They weren't about him, they were by him, and I was the guy that sat at the computer and wrote them. But first one was he picked his greatest players of all time and talked about why. And it was called Tom Seaver's All-Time Baseball Greats. And the second one was Tom and I picked great moments in baseball history. I wrote about the moment, and he commented on his view of that game or that play and what his thinking would have been at the time. He was a pretty heady ball player. So I'll tell you, my best memories of those 2 books are just sitting in his backyard in Connecticut, his wife Nancy refilling our lemonade glasses, and we sat and talked baseball all afternoon. If you can do that with a guy like Tom Seaver in the comfort of a backyard at a Connecticut mansion, you've had a good day.
Absolutely. Then you've also written a book called Now Pitching for the Yankees. That came out in 2002, and that was ESPN's Best New York Baseball Book of the Year. How'd that come about?
Also, a publisher encouraged me to write a memoir. He said, you're a good storyteller. You've been around all these celebrities. You worked with Phil Rizzuto and Joe DiMaggio and Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra, and how about just putting it down on paper? So Now Pitching for the Yankees was a memoir of a lot of the stuff we've talked about on this interview. Anytime somebody asks you to do a memoir, it's pretty flattering, and I guess you rarely say no. But
sure.
That was an enjoyable project. The problem was although it was well received and ESPN gave it that award, the publisher went out of business less than 6 weeks after the book came out. That meant that was the end of distribution, publicity, everything. So the book barely reached its audience. Yankee books generally find good homes among Yankee fans, Yankee universe. That one never really got its full readership, but people can still find it, and I think it's still on Amazon. It's called Now Pitching for the Yankees, and it's about my Yankee career and all the fun events we had with that.
Absolutely. One of probably maybe the biggest and most important or impactful book that you've written is Pinstripe Empire, the New York Yankees from before the Babe to after the Boss, published in 2012. It's important because it was really the first narrative history of the team since Frank Graham's 1943 book, The New York Yankees, An Informal History. Talk about how that book came about.
That is the book that I'm most proud of because it really is, I think, an important book in that it hadn't been done since 1943. Originally, it was going to be a biography of Colonel Jacob Ruppert, the Yankee owner who purchased Babe Ruth and owned the team up until 1939. And so the publisher had agreed to a biography of Jacob Ruppert, but then as I started the research and I realized what a void there had been, I reconnected with the publisher and I said, what if we just made this the whole history back to 1903 to the present? So we sort of reworked the plan, and the result was Pinstripe Empire, which has been updated a couple of times and hopefully will continue to be. And it really is, or it has come to be seen as the definitive narrative history of the Yankees. I say narrative because there have been some really excellent picture books covering their whole history, but this is the narrative version. This is the putting words to it, and people found it very conversational, very easy to digest, not like the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, but more of just a good baseball read.
Sure, absolutely. And Marty, we've got about 17 minutes left. I've got some more things I want to cover. One of those is the book that is coming out in paperback next week. It's called Casey Stengel, Baseball's Greatest Character. Now, Casey Stengel, he obviously is known as the old professor. He spoke Stengelese. He's the only person to have ever worn the uniforms for all the New York teams, the Dodgers, Yankees, Giants, and Mets. Talk about why you decided to write about Casey Stengel.
The book came out last spring in hardcover, so the paperback edition comes out next week. And I'm proud to say the book was named the best baseball book of 2017 and won a thing called the Casey Award, which is just a coincidence. It's named for the Casey at the Bat poem. But also a coincidence is I have a grandson named Casey, so be that as it may. Casey Stengel had a terrific biography written about him in the mid-1980s by my friend Bob Creamer, who was one of the founding editors of Sports Illustrated. And I love that book. It's a terrific book. But unavailable to Bob Creamer in the 80s was access to an internet where I was able to pick up a lot of long-lost anecdotes about Casey from the archives of newspapers in small towns that he played or managed in. And also, Casey's family provided me with an unpublished memoir written by Casey's wife, Edna, that she did in 1958, and it was never published and never seen, and Bob Creamer didn't know about it. So all of a sudden, I had a wealth of information to work with, and it really more than justified a new biography for this guy that was voted baseball's greatest character by no less than MLB Network when they did superlatives in their first and second year on the air. So they named Casey the greatest character in baseball history, and that was over Babe Ruth and Yogi Berra and Jackie Robinson and Dizzy Dean, and well, over everybody. He beat out 16,000 guys. So the book, again, nicely received, lots of laughs in there because Casey was a funny, funny guy. I learned a lot about Casey. I knew him a little bit because I was the guy that brought him back to Old Timers Day at the Yankees 5 times towards the end of his life. But the book is fresh and new, hardcover last March, paperback next week.
And you talk about, you know, these characters that you've gotten to experience, Casey Stengel and Yogi Berra, obviously, kind of being probably the two most prominent ones. When you know, Casey Stengel is probably known for 2 things really popularly, obviously, other than managing. He's probably known for winning a World Series game with a walk-off home run. And he also, notably in Ken Burns' series, also once lifted his hat and flipped and gave the bird to the crowd. So, as you mentioned, you know, I'm sure that there are many humorous stories in there from Casey, as he was voted the #1 character of all time by MLB Network. So everybody can check that out. That is on Amazon. It is at Barnes & Noble and various bookstores nationwide.
I want to say one more thing about Casey, because as I was doing my research and writing over 2 years, it became apparent to me that nobody under 40 had heard of Casey Stengel, let alone could name any of his accomplishments. So that was a big age group that wasn't going to be buying this book. I was obviously writing for an older audience. But just the fact that I made him relevant again and his name was in headlines again when they were book reviews made me feel good that the old guy was kind of back in the news. And for those of your listeners under 40 who aren't familiar with him, his first 5 years managing the Yankees, he won 5 straight world championships. Had never been done before or since. Maybe it'll never happen again. But after a long career of second division finishes in the National League, suddenly he had his ticket punched to Cooperstown and became acknowledged as a baseball genius.
Absolutely. From I think it was 47 or 48, all the way up until about 1960. 12 years, 7 World Series, and 9 American League championships. So
yeah, it was 10 pennants and 7 world championships.
10 pennants and 7 World Series, or 7 titles. Okay. So one of
don't mess with a baseball guy on facts, you know.
That's right. Absolutely.
When I was a kid in Queens, New York, if somebody told me that somebody hit 278 last year and it was 279, he lost his speaking privileges for 6 months. That's just the way it is.
Absolutely. I stand corrected, definitely. So one other really cool thing that you've been able to do, and you kind of mentioned this earlier when we were talking about King Kelly, is you served as the editor-at-large for the National Baseball Hall of Fame Museum's quarterly magazine, but you also helped to write the text on plaques for Hall of Fame inductees. Talk about that experience and what that was like.
Ed Stack was the president of the Baseball Hall of Fame, a good friend, and in 1979 he asked me if I could just review the copy that they were planning for the new inductees. So I was happy to do it, and one of them was Willie Mays, and under Willie's name it said, "Say Hey Kid." And I said, no, it's really the Say Hey Kid. It's not Say Hey Kid. Another one of those small little details. Anyway, that just started 21 years where I would review the copy and have my chance to participate in the input on it, and I love doing that. So I see those plaques there now that I had something to do with, and it's an extra special feeling.
who are some of the players that you got to, you mentioned Willie Mays, but who are some of the other players' plaques that you got to look over?
Well, the one that I like to talk about is the owner, Bill Veeck, because as some of your listeners may know, Bill Veeck, among other things, was kind of famous for signing a midget to go to bat in a game, Eddie Gaedel. Now we're faced with the problem of putting this on the plaque. It's actually the sort of thing that keeps you out of the Baseball Hall of Fame, not gets you in.
Right.
So how are we going to deal with Eddie Gaedel? Now, Bill was what you'd call a populist owner. The fans loved the guy, and he always seemed to do the fan-friendly thing. So I'm pondering for several days, what do we do about Eddie Gaedel? What do we do about the midget? And then I'm equating it with his acts of generosity towards the fans. And finally I say, you know what? Make the last line on the plaque say, "A champion of the little guy." And I thought that had it all covered.
Absolutely. And a very appropriate way to put that, too.
Yeah. So when I see that plaque in the Hall of Fame, I have special pride in that one.
Absolutely. As well you should. So a couple other cool things that to do is, and we have just under 10 minutes left, Marty. We one of the other cool things you've gotten to do is you're on the board of directors for two different organizations. One of them is the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center, and you are also a member of the board of trustees of the New York Sports and Hall of Fame, and you were a member of the advisory council of the Israel Baseball League. About being on the board of directors and trustees for those two organizations?
Yeah, that's sort of their honors that go with getting older and being in the business for a while, and proud to serve all of them. There's actually a couple of other things that I'm on the board now since that was written. One is the New York Transit Museum in Brooklyn. That's not really sports, but you think of the Subway series when you think of the subways. So I'm on the board of directors for the New York Transit Museum. And I also work with a group called Reach Out and Read, where I go every week to Bellevue Hospital, the nation's largest public hospital, and I read to the kids in the pediatric waiting room to sort of help develop a love for books for them. So those are things that I'm doing now that I really enjoy.
Is that what you're most proud of?
Most proud of my kids' success. My son is the founder and producer of Boston Calling, which is a major music festival every year in Boston. It'll be coming up this May, featuring Eminem as their lead performer. And my daughter works for CBS. So you've heard of CBS, and now when you watch CBS, think of Marty Appel's daughter.
Absolutely. Marty, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you for one more Mickey Mantle and one more Yogi Berra story to close it out today.
Okay. Well, Mickey, I had always wanted a broken bat when I was doing the fan mail. It didn't have to be Mickey's. I just wanted a souvenir broken bat. Elliot Ashley was the Yankee bat boy that year, and he made the final road trip of the season up to Fenway Park. And he brought me back a broken bat, and it could have been anybody's, but it was a Mickey Mantle bat, because Mickey had batted in the Saturday game in the first inning. He popped out to Rico Petrocelli, the shortstop, cracked the bat. It didn't break in half, but it was cracked. And Elliot scooped it up, remembered that I was looking for one, and he brought it back to me on Monday. Well, I loved it and obviously kept it, but it turned out that was Mickey Mantle's last time at bat. So that was really a treasure, and gosh, that was like one of the best things I ever owned. His last time at bat. Nobody knew it was his last time at bat. It didn't have that special bells and whistles going off. He took himself out of the game after that at bat, and he left. He actually flew back home, didn't play Sunday, he wasn't there, and that was the end of his career. He announced his retirement in spring training the following year. So I really wound up with a treasure there.
Do you still have that? Do you still have that bat?
I had it for over 25 years, and then I put it up for auction, and happy to say it paid for the first year of my son's college education. So it's a good use. Thank you, Mick.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely.
And you wanted a Yogi story?
Please.
Yogi was a man of few words, but everything he said, ultimately made sense, or nobody could say it quite like Yogi could, or he would observe things nobody else would. We were sitting around in the office at the Yogi Berra Museum one day, and we happened to be talking about Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe. And Yogi just pops in and says, I had dinner with them one night. And I startled, and I go, you did? Yogi, I have to know everything about that dinner. Everything. Tell me everything you remember about that dinner. He says, well, you know how when you order a shrimp cocktail, usually you get 5 shrimp? That night we got 8. And I said, that's your memory from the dinner with Joe and Marilyn? He says, that's what I remember. So Yogi was paying attention to the shrimp cocktail with Joe and Marilyn sitting at the table with him. And that was Yogi, a simple man who got right to the point. And those 8 shrimp instead of 4 or 5 was a big deal for him.
Absolutely. Well, Marty, I have taken up enough of your time. We have just about 3 minutes left here. Do you have any other things you'd like to promote on here? I know you mentioned the Casey Stengel book is coming out in paperback. Where can listeners find that?
The traditional book buyer places, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, but I also like to plug the independent bookstores who struggle but are great places, and buy it at an independent bookstore and support those guys if you can. That's a message I'd like to impart. And one last message I'd like to leave with you as I approach my 70th birthday and half a century in and around baseball. Now I have a grandson growing up in Boston, and people have always said to me, oh, you must hate the Mets, you must hate the Red Sox. And I've suddenly taken the position, there really shouldn't be room for hate in baseball or in sports, because that's not what sports is about. People tend to root for the team where they grew up, their hometown team, and that's terrific. I love Red Sox Nation. I love the way the fans support their team and turn out in force at Fenway Park. I don't have any hate in my heart for these rivalries. I like to beat those guys. I like to win the pennants. But sports doesn't have to be a place for hatred. So when people say to me, I'll bet you hate the Mets, no, I don't hate the Mets at all. I kind of root for their success. It would be fun to have a Yankee-Met World Series again. So that's kind of my final parting thoughts for you.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, what an hour this has been with New York Times best-selling author Marty Appel. He is the author of over 20 different books, a lot of Yankee books. He's a phenomenal and fantastic storyteller. He's been so gracious to be on the podcast. He is also an Emmy Award winner. And for those of you who are going to listen to this, he also had a pretty interesting summer of 1968 with Mickey Mantle. So please go ahead and make sure that you support him, buy his books at independent, at small bookshops, mom and pop. Make sure you're checking them out from your local library as well. Libraries are an important part in American culture. We need to make sure that people are supporting those as well. Marty, I cannot thank you enough for giving me an hour of your time and talking baseball and reminiscing with me. It's been one of the true joys that I've had since starting this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the kind words. Happy to be on with you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Marty Appel. He is the best-selling author of over 20 different books. Stay tuned. We've got 2 more episodes coming on later this evening. Thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll see you down the road in podcast land.